What if the oldest writing on earth was never meant to entertain or to comfort, but to outlast a silence that someone expected, an erasure so complete that only baked clay could resist it? What if the first cities learned, early on, that memory could be taken, and so they pressed their fear into mud while the river winds dried it into stone? And before you let your body sink completely into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if something in what I'm saying makes you want to stay a little longer. If you want, share your location and the time you're listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting through the night with me. In southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates once braided into marshland and silt, the ground still carries the outline of the first dense human experiments. Streets, courtyards, walls rebuilt on walls until the cities rose as mounds. In those mounds, a particular kind of object waits with an unnerving patience. Small rectangles and ovals of clay, sometimes broken, sometimes still whole, marked with wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed. They look modest. They weigh almost nothing in the mind at first, and yet the moment the signs are understood, they carry a strange pressure, as if they were never only about the day that made them. The modern recovery of these objects has its own unease, because it begins in the 19th century with trenches cut into ruins, with crates shipped out, with fragments catalogued far from their soil. In the 1840s and 1850s, excavations at sites associated with Assyria, especially the mounds at Kuyunjik near Mosul, identified with ancient Nineveh, brought to light rooms filled with tablets. The discovery is often linked to Austin Henry Layard and others working in the region under the momentum of imperial archaeology, and the tablets became associated with the royal library of Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king of the 7th century BCE. It is one of those finds that feels like a door left ajar. Tens of thousands of texts, not a single voice, and yet an entire bureaucracy of voices preserved. Some of those tablets are administrative, as dry as grain. Some are letters, some are omen series, lists of stars, medical recipes, rituals, inventories. And some are narratives that later generations would call myths and epics, accounts of gods, floods, kings, the founding of cities, the ordering of the world. The first instinct, especially in a modern mind trained to separate fact from poetry, is to file these narratives away as metaphor, the way a body turns from a disturbing dream and tries to forget its shape. But the tablets resist that comfort. They are too methodical. They repeat names with the consistency of record-keeping. They anchor stories in places that can still be walked. They place decisions in councils. They preserve titles, ranks, duties. Among the names that drift through these texts, Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, one cluster keeps returning like a refrain that refuses to be reduced: Anunnaki. The word itself is complicated, shifting across time and genre, and specialists still argue over nuances. Whether it points to a broad class of deities, whether it is tied to the offspring of Anu, whether it is more at home in one period's theology than another. In some contexts it leans toward the underworld, in others it becomes a collective for the great gods. And yet the persistence is what unsettles the imagination. The word does not behave like a casual flourish. It behaves like a category that mattered. Across Mesopotamian literature, the divine world is not only a mist of symbols, it is arranged. Anu stands at the top as a sky god in many traditions, while Enlil and Enki occupy different powers, air and authority in one hand, water and craft in another, though the exact emphases shift by city and century. Inanna rises in the south and becomes Ishtar in the north, carrying love and war, a bright planet name in her wake. Shamash watches as a sun judge. Sin is the moon. Marduk grows in Babylon's shadow until his story is written large. The surface of it all looks like religion, and it is. Temples functioned as economic engines as well as ritual centers. Priests and scribes served both gods and kings. Offerings were recorded. Festivals marked time. But there is another way to stare at the same material, a way that never claims certainty and yet cannot quite look away. It begins with a simple discomfort that these texts often speak as if they were keeping the world in order, not merely praising it, that they preserve procedures, that they cling to lists, that they track what should be done, what must not be done, what happens when a boundary is crossed. A world of gods, yes, but also a world of protocols. The mind drifts inevitably to the places where the record thins and the imagination tries to fill it. Some researchers, especially outside mainstream Assyriology, have argued that the so-called gods might have been described as gods because the language for anything else did not exist. Others dispute this entirely, pointing out how easily modern desires can colonize ancient symbols, and how readily a poetic cosmos can be misread as a technical report. Between those positions, the tablets remain what they are, a hard archive that will not confess to one interpretation and will not completely release the other. Even within cautious scholarship, there are features that linger. The texts are obsessed with origin points, the first city, the first kingship, the first ordering after catastrophe. They speak of floods in versions that are older than later biblical retellings, preserved in Akkadian epics, like Atrahasis, and in the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in Sumerian compositions that hint at earlier frameworks. They speak of decisions made by divine assemblies. They speak of one God warning a human through indirect speech, as if bound by rules. They describe the building of boats with dimensions and materials, not merely prayers and repentance. None of this proves anything beyond a literary tradition's texture. And yet the texture is the point. The record does not feel improvisational. It feels like something copied from something older, again and again, as if the copying itself was part of the defense against forgetting. The library at Nineveh, in particular, bears that feeling. Ashurbanipal's scribes collected and recopied texts from across Mesopotamia, and the tablets sometimes name older exemplars, sometimes note that a line is broken, sometimes preserve multiple versions of the same narrative. It is an archive built from fragments, and the fragments do not fit neatly. The more closely the clay is read, the more it seems to reveal that even ancient scribes lived with gaps, missing lines, damaged sources, stories whose endings were known, but whose middles were lost. The past was already a ruin to them. And there is something else, the sense in certain compositions that the divine world is not timeless. It changes. There are periods when gods walk close, when they speak directly, when their presence feels immediate in the story. Then, in later layers of tradition, the gods are invoked through rituals, approached through omens, reached through careful words said at careful times. This could be nothing more than theological development, religion evolving as political power shifts, as cities rise and fall, as languages change. But it could also be read as a memory of distance growing, a door slowly closing, an access that once seemed open becoming a matter of procedure and longing. When people speak in modern terms about a return, it is easy to assume the language comes from contemporary appetite for spectacle. But the ancient archive contains its own kind of return language, not always explicit, sometimes only implied, through cycles and appointed times, through the way celestial observation is bound to fate, through the way certain rituals are maintained as if awaiting their moment. The Mesopotamians watched the sky with intense seriousness. They compiled star lists. They tracked planetary appearances. They recorded omens. They developed calendars that required constant correction. This can be explained without mystery. Agriculture needs timing, kings need legitimacy, priests need order, empires need prediction. And yet, in the shadow of texts where gods descend and ascend, where gates between realms are spoken of, the watching can feel like more than farming. The most responsible approach is to let both possibilities remain in the room without allowing either to dominate. The tablets are not a confession of visitors, and they are not a simple fairy tale either. They are the residue of a civilization that believed the universe had administrators, believed that knowledge could be given and withdrawn, believed that catastrophe could be scheduled by councils beyond the human. Whether those beliefs were metaphor, theology, political ideology, or distorted memory is precisely what cannot be pinned down without forcing the clay to say what it does not say. And still the question persists, not because it is sensational, but because it is quiet. Why do some Mesopotamian texts feel less like prayer and more like procedure? Why does the archive at times resemble a set of documents meant to be consulted later, after a disruption, after a loss, after a long interval of absence? Why do the names, the ranks, the duties recur with such stubborn consistency, as if repetition itself was a safeguard? Outside the museum glass and the scholarly editions, the earth in Iraq keeps its own archive. Thousands of sites remain unexcavated. Many were looted. Many were damaged by war and weather and time. Many tablets sit unpublished or only partially studied. The record is immense, and yet it is also incomplete, and incompleteness is where strange interpretations breed. The archive offers enough to suggest a pattern, and not enough to confirm what that pattern means. Somewhere beneath the weight of all those pressed wedges, there is a sense that the oldest writers were doing more than telling stories. They were placing something into the future and hoping it would be read by minds that could tolerate ambiguity. They were preserving names that were not meant to vanish. They were maintaining a vocabulary for a presence that might have become absence. And if the absence was the point, if the fear was not of gods but of silence, then one question remained suspended over the clay, soft as a breath and hard as fired earth. What exactly did they think would come back when the record grew quiet? The first problem with the return is always time. Time stretches until it changes what a warning even means. A sentence pressed into clay can survive 5,000 years, but the world it points to does not hold still. Rivers move. Coastlines retreat. Cities are abandoned and built again. Languages die, and the signs that once belonged to everyone become puzzles that only a few can read, and even they argue over what the signs insist upon. In Mesopotamia, those arguments are not a modern invention. The tablets themselves are full of quiet disagreements, preserved as parallel versions, competing lines, alternate names. Scribes did not always pretend the tradition was singular. They copied what they inherited, even when it conflicted, and sometimes they marked uncertainty plainly. A line broken, a sign unclear, the exemplar damaged. The archive is honest about its own wounds, and yet, in the midst of these fractures, certain structures remain surprisingly stable. One of them is the idea that divine authority in Mesopotamia was not merely a drifting mist of holiness. It was organized. It convened. It issued decrees. It responded to crises with solutions that could be debated and enforced. The gods of the city were not only objects of devotion, they were also the city's reason for being, the legal and cosmic justification for its boundaries, its kings, its calendars. In a world where writing began as accounting, where clay first learned the shape of numbers and commodities, it is not strange that even the sacred would take on an administrative form. But it does create a particular atmosphere. The stories do not always feel like stories. They feel like memories that have been formalized. The Anunnaki emerge inside that atmosphere as a group name that seems to matter in relation to order and judgment. In some later Akkadian contexts, the Anunnaki are associated with the underworld, seated as judges with Ereshkigal, while other divine groups, like the Igigi, appear more aligned with the heavens. In earlier Sumerian material, the boundaries are not always so clean. Names shift, roles overlap. The divine family tree rearranges itself depending on whose city is speaking and which century is doing the copying. Scholars have long noted that Mesopotamian religion is not one religion, but many, layered over each other like the bricks of a ziggurat. Each new dynasty building on the old, each new city rewriting the cosmic map in its own dialect. Still, certain compositions keep a particular chill in the mind, not because they are violent, though many are, but because they sound like a problem being managed. The Atrahasis epic is one of these. It exists in Old Babylonian copies, and its story is echoed and reshaped later in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In it, the gods face a crisis not of sin, but of labor. The lesser deities, the Igigi, are said to be burdened with digging canals and doing the hard work of sustaining the world, and after years of this toil, they rebel. They surround the house of Enlil, the authority figure, and demand relief. In modern retelling, it can sound like mythic theater, but the original tone in translation often feels less theatrical than procedural. There is complaint, there is convening, there is negotiation, there is a solution. The solution is the creation of humans, described not as a romantic act of love, but as a practical replacement workforce. Some versions speak of mixing clay with the blood of a slain deity, a detail that has drawn endless interpretation, symbolic, ritual, or something else. Many Assyriologists treat it as mythic expression of a truth. Humans are both earthly and divine in their obligations, born to serve and to die. Others point out that the language can be read as metaphor for the way societies extract labor and justify it through religion. Either way, the story's shape is clear. A labor crisis is solved by manufacturing a labor force. What follows in Atrahasis is another managed crisis. Noise, crowding, unrest. Humanity multiplies. The gods are disturbed. Enlil proposes population control. First plague, then drought, then famine. In each case, Enki intervenes, offering guidance that allows humans to survive. Finally, the gods choose a flood, and this is the version of the flood story that feels most like an institutional decision. There is an oath, there is secrecy, there is enforcement. Enki finds a loophole by speaking to a wall, warning Atrahasis or Utnapishtim indirectly. After the flood, the gods regret the extremity. They institute measures to regulate human population, shortened lifespans, infertility, infant mortality, social constraints. The world is reorganized. None of this requires visitors from anywhere beyond imagination. It requires only a civilization that thinks in terms of systems and consequences, a civilization that knows intimately what it means for labor to break, for populations to become unmanageable, for environmental catastrophe to erase cities. Mesopotamia was a landscape where flooding was not an abstract myth, but a seasonal threat, and where drought could collapse kingdoms. The myths could be cultural memory of real disasters shaped into cosmic narrative. That explanation is enough. And yet, there is a residue left behind when the myths are read slowly. The gods are not only moral judges, they are managers. The language of decrees, of councils, of oaths, of enforcement carries a peculiar weight, especially when the texts are read alongside the administrative tablets of the same culture. Ration lists, work assignments, ship manifests. The same world that wrote down the distribution of beer to workers wrote down the distribution of destinies to gods. This is where the notion of recording visitors begins to tempt modern minds. Not because the text state it, but because the texture resembles bureaucracy. If the Anunnaki were imagined, the imagination that formed them was not airy. It was concrete. It spoke in lists and procedures. It described ranks. It preserved genealogies. It placed the divine in specific cities with specific temples, with specific obligations. It treated offerings not only as symbolic reverence, but as daily provisioning, recorded in quantities as if consumption mattered. Temple archives reinforce this practical quality. Temples were not simply quiet places for prayer. They were economic institutions that owned land, employed workers, managed herds, and distributed rations. In that environment, offerings to the gods could be framed as feeding the divine household, maintaining the divine estate. Whether anyone believed the god literally ate the bread is less important than the system that treated the act as essential to cosmic order. The result is a religion that looks, in its paperwork, like logistics. If a future reader wanted to see a shadow of visits, there are details that can be read in that direction. Ziggurats, for example, are often described as connecting heaven and earth. Their summit shrines were not public spaces. The great towers, like the ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, rise as massive terraces topped by a small sanctuary. The scale of the structure compared to the intimacy of the summit room can feel strange. Why raise such weight for such a small destination? Traditional answers are strong. Elevation signifies sacredness. Height brings the temple closer to the sky. The tower is a cosmic mountain on the flat plain. The ascent is symbolic. But there are also textual descriptions in later sources and traveler accounts of furnishing the summit chamber with a couch and table maintained for the god. Herodotus famously described such a chamber at Babylon, though his reliability is debated and his details are filtered through Greek expectations. Still, the idea appears, a room kept for a deity's use. In an ordinary devotional framework, this is still coherent. A god rests in the sense that the statue is enthroned, the divine presence is invited, the shrine becomes the body's dwelling. But in a different interpretive mood, the language can be heard with a harder edge. as if the room was kept ready because absence was not assumed to be permanent. The concept of return also gains oxygen from another feature of Mesopotamian culture, the obsession with celestial timing. Mesopotamian scholars, astronomer priests, omen readers, scribes trained in long series, watched the sky as if it were a text. They recorded planetary movements and eclipses. They used the heavens to interpret the will of the gods and later to advise kings. The tradition culminated in large compendia of omens like Enuma, Anu, and Enlil, which linked celestial events to earthly consequences. In such a worldview, the sky was not only scenery, it was communication. It carried signals. It marked appointed times. This is the place where a warning about return, if it existed, would naturally hide. In the calendar, in the stars, in cycles too long for one lifetime. Not because it proves anything, but because it matches the psychology of a culture that believed order was written above and enacted below. There is, then, a quiet intersection. Bureaucracy on earth, omens in the sky, decrees among the gods. A sense that catastrophes arrive not randomly, but as consequences of imbalance. Within that intersection, the Anunnaki can be read as theology, or as political metaphor, or as cultural memory of rulers whose authority was experienced as from above. Or they can be read by some as a distorted record of encounters with something unknown. The clay does not tell the reader which lens is correct. It only keeps the shapes intact long enough for the question to survive. And perhaps that is the true strangeness, that a civilization so devoted to fixing meaning into durable form left behind texts that still refused to settle. They offer councils and oaths, floods and decrees, beds prepared on high terraces, and star watchers keeping night-long records. They leave the impression of a world that expected patterns to repeat. If the gods once walked close and then withdrew into distance, what did the scribes think that distance meant? Was it the natural evolution of religion, the gods becoming more abstract as empires grew? Or was it a memory of a door that used to open, then did not, yet remained stubbornly a door? The record is not clear. The record is never completely clear. But in its gaps, the same soft question returns, like footsteps heard from the wrong side of a sealed chamber. If the old tablets preserve procedures for disaster and protocols for contact, what exactly were they keeping ready for? A return, if it is ever to be believed, has to pass through a gate. Sometimes the gate is stone, sometimes it is ritual, and sometimes it is nothing more than the fragile fact that a text survived at all, intact enough to be read. The survival of Mesopotamian writing was never guaranteed. Clay endures, but cities burn, and water softens what fire fails to harden. Libraries collapse, and their shelves become rubble. A tablet breaks into fragments and becomes a handful of unrelated wedges. Even when it survives, it can vanish into private hands or be carried far away, leaving the ground that once gave it meaning. That is why the modern encounter with the Anunnaki is shaped as much by absence as by presence. For every line that can still be read, there are lines that are gone. For every composition preserved in multiple copies, there are titles known only from a catalog and names that hover without a body. One of the reasons the Anunnaki feel so persistent is that their traces appear across genres that were never meant to be read as a single story. Hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, lexical lists, omen texts, liturgies, and administrative records sit beside one another in the excavated debris, and the divine names flow between them. This is not the coherence of a modern book. It is the coherence of a civilization that used the same sacred vocabulary to stabilize everything it did. And yet, the most famous concentration of Mesopotamian texts did not survive because anyone intended it to be a message to distant centuries. It survived because a library was buried in catastrophe. In the 19th century, when European excavations began cutting into the mounds of ancient Assyria, one site in particular yielded a kind of shock. Thousands upon thousands of tablets from the great palace complex at Nineveh, associated with the reign of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. Many of these tablets had been stored as part of a royal library, gathered from across the empire, copied and recopied by scholars and scribes, arranged as if the king believed knowledge itself was a form of power. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the palace burned and collapsed. That violence, paradoxically, preserved what it crushed. Tablets that were still raw or only sun-dried could be baked hard by the heat of destruction. Shelves could become sealed layers. The library did not survive because it was protected. It survived because it was buried. That burial became the modern gate. Yet even this gate is partial. The Nineveh tablets arrived to modern scholarship broken, scattered, mixed. Pieces of one composition lay far from one another, and for decades, sometimes for more than a century, fragments sat in different drawers in different collections, waiting for the slow labor of joining. The story of translation is not only a story of decipherment, it is a story of reconstruction. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as it is known today, was assembled from tablets discovered in pieces, with gaps that remain, and with lines restored only as educated guesses. The flood narrative inside it became famous partly because it echoed another tradition. But even there, the record is not clean. The flood appears in different forms, in Atrahasis, in the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh, in the Sumerian flood traditions. Names vary. Details shift. The same event is told with different emphases, as if different cities and centuries kept their own version of the same fear. This is the environment in which claims about warnings become difficult to hold. A culture can leave a warning without intending it, simply by preserving a pattern of anxiety. It can also lose a warning even if it intended the opposite. The clay does not protect meaning. It protects only marks. The Anunnaki themselves, in the best attested scholarship, are not a single fixed entity across all time. They are a divine collective whose roles and associations shift between Sumerian and Akkadian contexts, between early and late periods, between literary and ritual use. In some texts, they are great gods who decree destinies. In others, they are connected to the underworld as judges. At times, they appear as a class beneath a higher authority. At times, they are simply a way of naming the gods in a formal register. These variations are not signs of deception. They are signs of a living tradition evolving over millennia. And still, certain motifs keep returning with stubborn consistency. Councils, decrees, destinies, and the sense that the cosmos is not a drifting dream, but a managed system. Even the idea of fate is not merely poetic in Mesopotamia. It is procedural. It can be written, assigned, confirmed. There is an old and unsettling emphasis on the power of names and the authority of a decision once declared. Some compositions treat divine command as something that must be spoken correctly, inscribed correctly, performed correctly. The universe becomes a kind of legal order in which errors have consequences. Within that framework, stories about objects like the Tablet of Destinies take on their sharpest edge. In myths where this tablet is stolen, cosmic order falters until it is recovered. In modern eyes, it is natural to treat such an object as symbolic, a narrative device for authority, a way of dramatizing the theft of legitimacy. Yet the myths insist on its physicality. It can be held, it can be worn, it can be taken. The divine does not float free of matter. It anchors itself in things, temples, statues, ritual vessels, tablets. This anchoring is one of the reasons the idea of visitors can feel tempting. Visitors, too, would require anchors, places to arrive, items to control, procedures to enforce. The temptation grows strongest not when the texts speak of wonder, but when they sound mundane. A king boasts that the gods favored him, and the boast reads like political messaging. A temple record lists offerings, and the offerings read like provisioning. A ritual text prescribes a sequence, and the sequence reads like protocol. A scholar priest watches the sky for omens, and the watching reads like monitoring. Yet it is not necessary to step outside history to explain these patterns. Mesopotamian religion was inseparable from governance. Temples were economic centers. Kingship was legitimated through divine sanction. The gods were woven into city identity. A council of gods mirrors and perhaps reinforces the assemblies and negotiations of human politics. The order of heaven becomes the model for the order of the palace. Even the long, trembling fascination with cycles can be explained within known realities. The Mesopotamian world was fragile. Floods could erase harvests. Droughts could empty canals. Empires rose and fell with brutal speed. Under such conditions, it is natural to imagine history as recurring patterns rather than a straight line. It is natural to encode meaning into the sky because the sky appears consistent even when the ground fails. The disciplined observation of celestial movement, later written into omen series and astronomical diaries, becomes a way of finding stability, a way of persuading a chaotic world to confess its schedule. But there is a quieter problem that remains, and it lives in the spaces between tablets. The modern corpus is uneven. Some cities, like Nineveh, have yielded enormous textual archives. Others are known mostly from ruins and a few inscriptions. Many tablets were excavated under 19th century conditions that did not preserve context carefully by modern standards. Provenience can be uncertain, layers can be mixed, collections can be separated. And even when a text is known to exist, it can be inaccessible for long stretches of time, trapped in storerooms, unpublished, awaiting cataloging. There is no need to claim deliberate suppression to feel the weight of this. Bureaucracy is enough. War is enough. The slow shortage of time and resources in museums is enough. In that sense, sealed archives are not always romantic. They are often literal. A tablet in a drawer is sealed by neglect. A fragment without a join is sealed by chance. A damaged line is sealed by fire that saved the rest. So the idea of a warning becomes, in practice, a matter of method. What can be said from what survives, and what must be left as silence. When modern readers look for return, they look for explicit prophecies, for dates, for clean predictions. Mesopotamian texts rarely offer that kind of clarity. What they offer more often is a mood of vigilance, a world watched by gods, a sky watched by scholars, a city maintained through ritual as if maintenance itself prevents collapse. A sense that when rules are violated, consequences come. If a return exists in this archive, it may not be written as a single sentence that announces itself. It may be distributed, like ash across a burnt room, a ritual that keeps a gate conceptually open, an omen that treats certain configurations as thresholds, a temple practice that continues long after the original meaning is forgotten. It may be present not as proclamation, but as habit. And habits survive in ways declarations do not. A tablet breaks, but a festival repeats. An archive burns, but a prayer is copied again. A city falls, but its God's name travels to the next capital and takes on a new accent. Continuity is not always evidence. Sometimes it is simply inertia. Sometimes it is longing dressed up as tradition. Still, there is one more gate to consider, and it is older than Nineveh's rubble. It is the gate of the earliest writing itself, the moment when a civilization begins to press memory into clay and believes that clay can outlast death. Once that belief exists, a warning can be written without knowing who will read it, and a reader can feel addressed even when the writer never imagined such a future. The clay cannot promise a return, but it can preserve the feeling that something once stood close, then withdrew, leaving procedures behind. And if procedures remain after presence fades, the question becomes sharper, not softer. Were the procedures merely the language of devotion, or were they the maintenance rituals of a relationship that once felt practical? Somewhere in the broken joins between fragments, that question continues to wait for its missing lines. A warning, if it was ever written as a warning, would have to survive the simple violence of time. It would have to survive rain that turns clay back into mud and fires that shatter what they harden. It would have to survive collapse, theft, and the quiet grinding of rubble into dust. And even if the clay endured, meaning would still be fragile because the marks can outlast the last person who knew how to read them. Mesopotamian writing endured in the ground for millennia, but it returned to the modern world as silence. Early excavators could lift tablets from the soil, see the dense fields of wedge-shaped impressions, and still be unable to hear a single word. That gap between survival and comprehension became its own sealed chamber, a room full of texts that no living person could enter. The first breach in that chamber did not come from a temple mound in Iraq, but from a cliff in western Iran. The Behistun inscription, carved high above an ancient road, carried the same political message in multiple scripts, including Old Persian and Akkadian. In the 19th century, scholars such as Henry Rawlinson copied and studied it, and the multilingual comparison helped unlock cuneiform. The gate opened slowly. Signs became sounds, names became sequences. A dead archive began to move again. Even then, the opening was partial. Akkadian yielded earlier than Sumerian, and much of Sumerian was approached through later bilingual texts and lexical lists that paired Sumerian phrases with Akkadian explanations. The oldest layers of the archive often arrive through later hands. A word survives, but it comes with a gloss that may reflect a scribe's school tradition more than a city's earliest memory. This is one reason the Anunnaki sit in such unstable light. The term appears across centuries, but it does not behave like a modern proper noun with a single fixed referent. In some compositions, it names a collective of high gods linked to decrees and destinies. In other contexts, it leans toward the underworld, toward judges, toward the weight of death. Sometimes it simply functions as a formal way of naming the gods. The archive resists the modern desire for a single chart of ranks and roles. The resistance is structural. Mesopotamian texts were not produced as a unified book. A hymn does not promise the same kind of truth as a legal text. A royal inscription does not speak like a ritual prescription. A myth can be playful, cruel, political, and devotional at once. Divine names drift across these forms, and the drift can look like continuity or like redefinition, depending on which tablet happens to survive. The modern world met this drift most intensely through a library that survived by disaster. In the ruins of Nineveh, thousands of tablets associated with the royal library of Ashurbanipal, 7th century BCE, were found, preserved in part because the palace collapsed and buried them. The discovery was immense, but it arrived broken. Fragments scattered, copies differed. A work could exist in several versions, separated by centuries of copying. Meaning came with missing lines and sometimes with missing endings. In that environment, return becomes hard to hold without overreach. Certain lines can sound like cycles, like appointed times, like the sky acting as a clock. Yet much of the Mesopotamian corpus thrives on repetition by design. Omens that tie celestial patterns to political outcomes, rituals that maintain calendars, king lists that compress time into symbolic reigns. Some researchers argue that such texts preserve memories of real shocks, floods, collapses, invasions, reframed as cosmic pattern. Others argue that pattern is the point and that the point is not prediction, but governance, a way to make uncertainty administrable. Objects like the Tablet of Destinies sharpen this unease. In the myths where it appears, it is not merely an abstraction. It can be stolen, carried, reclaimed. Order trembles when it is missing. A symbolic reading is plausible. Authority is treated as an object because authority feels heavy, portable, and vulnerable. But the physical insistence remains, and it tempts other readings, especially when modern readers search for bureaucratic echoes, councils, decrees, procedures, inside divine language. Yet the simplest explanation for the bureaucratic tone is also the most historically grounded. Temples were economic institutions. Priests managed grain, labor, land, and debt. Kingship was justified through divine sanction, and sanction was maintained through ritual. The gods appear in inventories and provisions because the temple functioned as a corporate body, and because the divine was the legal owner of much that humans administered. What remains most haunting then is not a single sentence promising a return, but the persistence of maintenance. The right procedure matters. The right sequence is repeated, as if repetition keeps a gate from closing. The sky is watched. Even where later texts feel more distant, they preserve the sense of vigilance. A world monitored by gods, and monitored by those who monitor the gods. And there is a more ordinary kind of sealing that still shapes what can be said. The corpus is uneven. Excavations were not always careful by modern standards. Provenience can be unclear. Fragments were scattered across collections. Unpublished tablets and unjoined pieces remain even now, locked not by conspiracy, but by the bottleneck of cataloging, access, and time. A tablet in a drawer is sealed by neglect. So the question of a warning becomes a question of method. What can be said from what survives, and what must be left as quiet? If a return exists in this record, it may not be announced as a prophecy with a date. It may be distributed as habit, a festival that repeats after its origin is forgotten, a ritual that keeps a threshold conceptually open, an omen tradition that treats certain configurations as doors. It may be present not as proclamation, but as an ache that clings to the edges of the texts where certainty is too expensive to buy. Somewhere in that quiet lies a smaller uncertainty that refuses to disappear. In the oldest writing, a single sign can mean sky, heaven, and the name of a god. It can be a place, a concept, and a person. When that sign appears in phrases sometimes rendered as descent from heaven to earth, is it a story about literal movement, or a metaphor for authority, or a memory that no longer has a safe translation? The clay holds the wedges hold the ambiguity, and the ambiguity, like a closed door with light under it, continues to wait. There are lists that feel like ledgers, and there are ledgers that feel like spells. Somewhere between the two sits a text that keeps returning, copied and recopied as cities rose and fell, as languages shifted, as dynasties tried to stitch their own names into something older than memory. The Sumerian king list does not read like a simple chronicle. It begins before the ground feels stable. It begins with a sentence that still unsettles careful historians because it is both plain and impossible. Kingship descended from heaven. Then it moves into names that belong to places archaeology can point to: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, and yet it pairs them with reigns so long they stretch beyond any human horizon. Alulim of Eridu, it says, ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000. Others follow, their reigns counted in numbers that repeat and accumulate with an eerie confidence, as if time itself had once been measured differently, or as if the act of writing numbers was more important than belief in their literal weight. Then, without drama, without a flood story, without a moral lesson, the line arrives. The flood swept over. After that, kingship is lowered again, and the lengths begin to shrink. Modern scholarship does not treat those first figures as historical kings in the ordinary sense. Many researchers read them as mythic ancestors, or as a symbolic prelude designed to give later dynasties cosmic legitimacy. Others note that the king list exists in multiple versions with variation and political shaping. Certain cities are emphasized, certain dynasties elevated, certain transitions smoothed, as if the text is not merely recording the past, but arranging it. Yet the discomfort remains, because the list does not behave like pure myth either. It names real cities in the order they matter to the river plains. It preserves sequences that align, at least in the later sections, with rulers and periods supported by inscriptions and archaeological context. It stands with one foot in the world of verifiable kings and another in a time before verification can breathe. One of the most famous exemplars is a clay prism often called the Weld-Blundell prism from the early 2nd millennium BCE, now in the Ashmolean Museum. Its faces carry the list in columns, as if the text was meant to be turned in the hands, read slowly, revisited. A prism is an object that suggests permanence. It does not roll like a cylinder seal. It does not fold like a letter. It simply stands, insisting that a list can be an axis. What kind of culture makes an axis out of a list? A culture whose life depended on accounting, on measures, on the control of grain and labor and water. In southern Mesopotamia, the management of canals was not a convenience, but a condition of survival. Writing emerged first for administration, counts, deliveries, rations. Numbers were not decoration. They were power. And the number system itself matters here. Mesopotamian mathematics used a sexagesimal base, a system in 60s that still leaves traces in modern timekeeping. Within that system, certain large units recur. A sar is a unit associated with 3,600, a number that is 60 times 60. The long reigns of the earliest kings often resolve into combinations of such units. To a modern eye, that can look like coding. Reigns built from sacred mathematics, not from human biology. To another eye, it can look like faithful copying of inherited tradition, where the form of the number carries the weight of truth more than the plausible length of a life. Some researchers argue that these numbers function like architecture. They build scale. They make the pre-flood world immeasurably distant, so that the flood becomes a hinge, a reset, an event that divides not only history, but the very texture of time. In that reading, the long reigns are a literary technology, a way to declare that the world before the hinge was not merely earlier, but other. Others suggest a more political function. By stretching the past into vast spans, the list grants authority to later kings by placing them inside a single, heaven-sanctioned chain. Dynasties that might otherwise look brief and fragile become part of a continuous institution. The list is not only a record but a remedy for instability. It says the office survives, even if the cities do not. But even that explanation leaves certain details standing like stones that refuse to lie flat. The list is not simply propaganda for one city. It shifts its center. Eridu, then Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, then elsewhere, echoing the real pattern of regional power. It is a political text, yes, but it is also a memory of rivalry, a map of successive dominance. And then there is the quiet precision with which the flood is placed. In Mesopotamian literature, flood narratives exist in different forms. The Sumerian flood story, often called the Eridu Genesis, the Akkadian Atrahasis, and the flood episode embedded in the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. These are not identical stories, but they share structural bones. A divine decision, a warning, a survival vessel, a new order afterward. The king list, by contrast, does not narrate. It only marks. That mark is chilling because it implies that the flood was not merely a tale told for fear or comfort, but a reference point in a chronology. It functions like a date line in a ledger. Before this, after this. It does not ask for belief. It assumes it. Yet what is assumed exactly? Scholars debate what kind of flood the texts preserve. Some see echoes of regional river catastrophes on the Mesopotamian plain, devastating but not global. Others note that flood deposits appear at some sites and not others, and that different layers reflect different events at different times. The archaeology does not yield a single universal deluge. The literature yields a powerful archetype. Between them, the record thins. And in thinning, it creates a space where hypotheses multiply. Some readers insist the king list preserves a literal memory. Beings whose lifespans were not human. Rulers whose years were not measured by the same sky. Others insist the opposite. The long reigns are numerological, a symbolic opening that belongs to myth and theology rather than history. The archive, as usual, does not choose a single voice. What can be said without stepping beyond the clay is narrower but still unsettling. The king list demonstrates that Mesopotamian scribes could hold incompatible registers in the same hand. A line can be mythic and administrative at once. A city can be real while its first king is impossible. Time can be counted precisely while its meaning slips. The later portions of the list, when dynasties draw nearer to historical light, show reigns that are plausible and cross-checkable in places. Here the text becomes what modern readers expect: names, durations, successions. And that transition itself becomes part of the unease. The list does not break. It does not announce a change of genre. It simply continues, as if the earlier vastness and the later plausibility belong to the same world. There is a temptation always to treat that seam as proof of something, proof of lost longevity, proof of alien memory, proof of invented myth. But another possibility sits quietly alongside those extremes. Perhaps the seam is the point. Perhaps the list is teaching the mind to live with two scales at once: the scale of daily governance and the scale of cosmic time, the scale of a canal inspection and the scale of a flood that ends an age. If that is true, then the most haunting detail is not the length of Alulim's reign, but the confidence of the scribal hand that wrote it down. Because the hand belongs to a culture that knew the difference between plausible and impossible, that could measure a field and calculate a ration, that could punish fraud. And still it preserved the impossible as a formal entry, aligned in columns like the rest. So the king list remains a threshold text. It invites the modern mind to step forward, then stops it at a line that will not open. Kingship descended from heaven. The flood swept over. Kingship descended again. Between those phrases, the archive holds its breath, and the question lingers in the same place it always does. What did the scribes believe they were preserving when they wrote time as if it once belonged to someone else? The words arrive first as shapes, wedges pressed into clay, triangles and strokes that look simple until they begin to multiply, until the eye realizes the marks are not decorative but disciplined. A language made of angles, built to survive fire, built to outlast the voices that once spoke it. Most of what is known about ancient Mesopotamia comes through these marks, yet the marks are never complete. Tablets crack, edges shear away. A line of signs can dissolve into a blank where a thumb once rested too hard, or where water softened clay that was never fully fired. Whole libraries were shattered when walls collapsed. The world that produced writing did not protect writing. It buried it, broke it, scattered it. When 19th century excavators began pulling tablets from the ruins of Nineveh, they were not recovering a tidy archive. They were recovering debris, tens of thousands of fragments from the library assembled under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, a collection meant to gather older knowledge from across Mesopotamia. Many pieces were already centuries old when they were copied for the Assyrian court. Many were themselves copies of copies. In some cases, the colophons say so plainly, an old tablet, a damaged tablet, a tablet from a distant city, a tablet written and checked. Even then, the tradition admits its own fragility. The clay that survives is now dispersed. The British Museum holds large parts of the Nineveh corpus. The Louvre holds others. The Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin holds others still. So do collections in Istanbul and Baghdad, in Philadelphia, in Oxford, in New Haven. Each collection has drawers and accession numbers, catalogs and shelf marks, modern systems layered over ancient ones. The tablets sit under controlled light, under climate regulation, under glass, and still they remain incomplete, as if they carry the desert inside them. From this broken field, translators build sentences. They do it carefully, but the careful work cannot remove uncertainty. Cuneiform is not one language, it is a script used for many: Sumerian, Akkadian, and others. A single sign can carry multiple values. A single word can be written with logograms, with phonetic complements, with determinatives that narrow meaning but do not always guarantee it. Even when the signs are clear, the intent can remain folded. This is where the Anunnaki enter, and where the air grows slightly colder. The name is real. It appears in Sumerian and Akkadian contexts across a long span. It does not behave like a single stable concept in the way modern popular retellings often suggest. In some texts, the Anunna or Anunnaki are a collective, an assembly of gods, a council, the princely offspring of Anu, the sky god. In other texts, they are linked with the underworld, with judgment, with the realm of the dead. In still other passages, the term can seem almost administrative, a category of divine beings distinguished from other divine categories, invoked in rituals, listed in laments, named in hymns. Scholars disagree not only about what the Anunnaki are in a given text, but about how much any one passage should be allowed to govern the whole. The same word can move with genre. In a myth, it can feel like a dramatis personae. In a lament, it can feel like a chorus. In an incantation, it can feel like a legal signature on a cosmic document. The language does not always say what later readers want it to say. And this is the quiet problem at the center of the midnight question. If the tablets are treated as records, then the records must first be read in the way their writers used language, not in the way modern minds crave narrative. Yet the longing remains because the writing itself can sound disconcertingly procedural. Councils convene, decrees are issued, oaths are demanded, specific duties are assigned, punishments are calibrated. In texts like Atrahasis, the divine decision-making is described with a bureaucratic rhythm that makes the gods feel less like symbols and more like governors. In the flood accounts embedded in Atrahasis and in Gilgamesh, the plan is not merely announced, it is engineered. Dimensions are given, materials are specified, bitumen is named, decks are counted. The craft is described as if the survival of a project depended on precision, but precision is not proof of literalness. It can also be a literary technique, a way of making a story feel heavier, more anchored, by embedding the language of real work inside the language of myth. Ancient writers knew the power of detail. They knew that a list of measures can make an impossible event feel closer to the ground. There is also the fact that much of what survives is not the earliest. The oldest written Sumerian texts are largely administrative. The great narratives and mythological compositions come through later copies, often from old Babylonian schools, where scribes trained by copying standard compositions. What looks like an ancient eyewitness voice can, in practice, be a tradition curated by centuries of education. That does not make it false. It makes it mediated. The voice comes through an institution, the scribal house, the temple archive, the royal library. Institutions, by their nature, filter. They preserve what is useful, what is authorized, what is worth copying. Sometimes they preserve contradictions. Sometimes they harmonize them. Sometimes the record simply goes quiet, because the tablet that carried a passage did not survive, or because the fragment lies unrecognized in a drawer, or because the signs are too damaged for a confident reading. Silence in the archive can be caused by many things: carelessness, catastrophe, the slow abrasion of time, or occasionally deliberate selection. The difference is hard to prove from absence alone. This is why the modern story of translation is part of the mystery. Every reading is a choice made against a field of broken clay. A scholar decides whether a sign is this value or that, whether a damaged wedge implies a plural ending or not, whether a word is a title or a name, whether a phrase should be rendered literally or smoothed into idiom. Two competent readers can disagree, and their disagreements can change the mood of a passage completely, from cosmic poetry to practical instruction, from metaphysical metaphor to something that sounds uncomfortably like procedure. The most responsible readers admit this. They annotate uncertainty. They mark broken lines with brackets. They offer alternative reconstructions. They publish editions that show the gaps, so the gap itself becomes part of what is known. In that practice, the clay is allowed to remain clay, rather than being forced into a single clean story. And yet, outside the additions, stories harden. A word becomes a verdict, a category becomes a species, a metaphor becomes a landing. The Anunnaki become visitors, not because the tablets say it plainly, but because certain passages, read in a certain way, sound as if they could bear that weight, and because the human mind is hungry for a single explanation that ties complexity into a single rope. Some researchers have publicly argued such possibilities for decades, while Assyriologists continue to point out that many of these claims rely on readings the languages do not support, or on modern inferences projected back into ambiguous signs. The debate itself has become part of the modern mythology surrounding the old texts, a contested border between translation and interpretation, between what the clay allows and what imagination wants. But the clay still insists on its own rhythms. In the Omen series, Enuma, Anu, Enlil, scholars see a different kind of Mesopotamian mind at work, a vast corpus linking celestial events to terrestrial outcomes, compiled and copied over long periods. Eclipses, planetary appearances, unusual halos around the moon, these are recorded with a seriousness that feels like surveillance. The sky is treated as a page where messages appear, messages that must be interpreted because consequences are believed to follow. Whether those consequences are political, agricultural, or ritual, the posture is the same. Watch, record, compare, and wait. Here, the sense of return can enter without requiring a literal visitor. If the heavens are a text, then changes in the heavens are announcements. If cycles repeat, then old patterns can come back. If an Omen series preserves that logic across centuries, it begins to feel like a system built for recurrence, built for the reappearance of conditions that once mattered. And when the mind turns back to the Anunnaki, those collective powers invoked in councils and underworld judgments, the question shifts slightly. What if the warning was not about a ship returning through the sky, but about a pattern returning through time? What if descent is a word that can mean both an arrival and a reassertion, both a visitor stepping down and an old authority resurfacing in human affairs? The texts do not settle the question. They only keep offering fragments that can be assembled in more than one way. Somewhere in the drawers of the great collections, there are still pieces not fully published, pieces with lines too broken to read cleanly, pieces that might belong to compositions already known or to compositions no longer understood as whole. And the archive, patient as a sealed room, continues to hold back its missing lines. If there is a warning in all this, it might be this: the most dangerous thing about ancient writing is not what it says, but how easily the mind can complete what it does not say. And yet, even with that caution held close, the clay remains stubbornly suggestive, because the sky-watching texts do not merely tell stories. They keep count. They keep watch. They preserve the feeling that something at intervals crosses a threshold that should not be crossed lightly, and that the next sign might already be forming in the dark above the river plain. In the oldest cities, the ground is layered like memory. A street becomes a floor becomes rubble becomes fill, and above it another floor is laid, another wall raised, another doorway opened onto a life that will eventually collapse into the same silence as the one beneath it. Archaeologists learn to read this silence by cutting down through it. A trowel scrapes a surface. A brush sweeps away dust. A color change in soil signals a new horizon. Charcoal in a lens of ash hints at a burned roof. Shards of pottery, diagnostic in shape and temper, anchor a layer to a span of centuries. In southern Iraq, where the rivers have wandered and the land has slowly risen through silt, the work becomes more complicated. Water tables sit high. Salts bloom in the bricks. Whole landscapes have moved. When the excavations at Eridu were carried out in the mid-20th century, the result was both simple and unsettling. Beneath later buildings and eroded mounds lay a sequence of temples, one above another, stretching back into the Ubaid period. The deepest levels belonged to a time when the city was small, when the first shrine was modest, when urban life was still an experiment. And yet the rebuilding was persistent. The sacred spot was returned to again and again, as if the location mattered more than the structure, as if something about the coordinates held a claim on the imagination. Eridu is tied in text to Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, craft, and the deep. The later literary tradition calls it the earliest city, the place where kingship descended, the place where civilization began. Those phrases sit between poetry and doctrine. They do not read like neutral archaeology. They read like a culture explaining itself through mythic origin. Yet the insistence is notable. Eridu is placed at the start of the chain, and Enki is placed at the heart of its beginnings. In the archaeological record, the beginnings of southern Mesopotamian complexity do not arrive as a single lightning strike, but they do arrive quickly. By the late 4th millennium BCE, Uruk is enormous, with large-scale architecture, specialized production, administrative systems, and writing in its earliest forms. Many models try to explain how this happened: the management of irrigation, the growth of trade networks, the demands of temple households, the pressures of population. None of these models is careless. None needs gods to function. And yet each model is, by necessity, a reconstruction built from incomplete traces. The record is thick with pottery and walls, but thin with inner motives. The temptation to fill that thinness with a single cause has always been strong. In the ancient texts, one cause is offered repeatedly. The gods taught, the gods endowed, the gods established institutions. In modern scholarship, those statements are treated as the language of legitimacy, the way a city or a king explains authority. Yet even legitimacy claims can preserve faint impressions of actual transitions because a society will usually attach divine origin to what feels foundational, to what feels like it came from beyond ordinary human capacity. This is why the me becomes so difficult to set down. In Sumerian literature, the me are described as powers, decrees, norms, things that define how the world works, how society is organized, how crafts and rituals exist. They are linked with Enki, who is portrayed as their custodian. In the composition often called Inanna and Enki, Inanna acquires the me from Enki and brings them to Uruk, and the city prospers. Modern readers often mistake this narrative for a story about theft in the literal sense, but the composition is also political theology. It speaks to the rise of Uruk, to the transfer of cultural authority, to how one city becomes preeminent. The me can be understood as the imagined cargo of civilization itself. And still, the text describes them as if they can be carried. It lists them in a manner that resembles an inventory. It places them in the Abzu, Enki's domain. It has messengers chase a boat as if a crucial shipment has been stolen. Even if the narrative is allegory, it uses the language of logistics. The mind hears the language of logistics and begins to wonder what kind of thing could be both symbolic and treated as cargo. But symbols can be cargo. A crown is a symbol, and it is carried. A seal is a symbol, and it is carried. A tablet is a symbol, and it is carried. In ancient Mesopotamia, authority was material. To rule was to possess certain objects: a staff, a ring, a seal, an inscribed decree. A deity's presence could be concentrated in a statue, housed in a temple, fed with offerings. Divine power in Mesopotamia often came with physical paraphernalia. The gods were not merely ideas. They were embodied in cult objects and maintained through ritual economy. In that world, it is not strange that the me, even as abstract norms, are imagined as portable, as transferable, as something a city can have. Yet the composition does something else that keeps the late-night question alive. It blends together categories that modern minds keep separate. Skills sit beside emotions. Social roles sit beside cosmic functions. Sexual practices sit beside kingship. Truth sits beside the craft of the builder. It is as if the me are not a list of discrete technologies, but a list of operating conditions, the parameters of a human world. They define what can exist, what can be done, what can be permitted. In that reading, the me are less like machines and more like software, code that shapes behavior and institutions. But software still has to be stored somewhere. In a modern mind, the metaphor begins to sharpen in directions the ancient text never intended. The Abzu itself deepens the ambiguity. In myth, the Abzu is the primeval freshwater beneath the earth, associated with Enki. It is also portrayed as an architectural space. Enki builds his abode there. Other gods travel to it. It contains treasures, wisdom, the me. The word has a natural meaning, but the literature gives it rooms. In the physical landscape of southern Iraq, water matters in a way that makes the myth feel less like pure imagination. Fresh water rises from below. Canals cut the earth. Marshes breathe. Cities depend on the management of flow. A god of the Abzu is not an abstract philosophical invention. He is the embodiment of survival. And yet, the literary Abzu is too neat, too contained. It is a place where secrets are stored, where rules are administered, where plans are made. It is the opposite of the chaotic marsh. It is a controlled depth. It is the kind of depth a bureaucracy would build if a bureaucracy could build in the underworld. Some researchers have wondered whether the Abzu descriptions might preserve memory of actual subterranean architecture. Workshops, storage spaces, chambers below temples, now lost to erosion, collapse, or the limits of excavation under waterlogged soil. Others argue that the Abzu is a symbolic space, the mythic deep that anchors the world, where wisdom and life emerge. Both positions can be held without breaking the known evidence. The clay allows both. The ruins confirm neither. And then there is the larger problem that refuses to settle: the discontinuity between the oldest myths and the later texts. Early Sumerian compositions, preserved in Old Babylonian copies, often feel closer to local cult and city politics. Later Akkadian texts, like Enuma Elish, shape the gods into imperial ideology, with Babylon's Marduk elevated above others. Names shift, emphases shift. Gods merge or take on new titles. The Anunnaki themselves move through these transformations, sometimes a general collective, sometimes underworld judges, sometimes participants in cosmic hierarchy. If the Anunnaki were visitors, one might expect a consistent technical description across time. But what survives is a tradition that evolves, and that evolution looks like human culture, doing what human culture always does: retelling, adapting, reframing. And still, evolution does not erase the persistent motifs. Councils, decrees, oaths, logistics, the sense that governance of the world is deliberated rather than simply willed, the sense that catastrophe can be decided as policy, the sense that the gods, even in myth, are constrained by rules, by balances, by something like procedure. These motifs are not universal across all ancient mythologies. They are particularly Mesopotamian, shaped by a culture that built its survival on administration, on counting, measuring, recording, predicting. If the Anunnaki were a category of divine authority, then perhaps the visitor feeling is a byproduct of the administrative imagination. The gods are described like officials because officials were the highest human reality. A temple was run like an estate. A palace was run like a machine. The cosmos, in such a worldview, would naturally look like a hierarchy with duties and protocols. But late at night, in the quiet where certainty thins, another possibility can still be held without claiming it as fact. A society that suddenly becomes literate, urban, astronomically attentive, and administratively intense might, in its own memory, attribute the transition to an outside imposition, an arrival, a teaching, a gift. Not because it was literally outside, but because it felt outside. It felt like a threshold crossed. And thresholds are what the texts keep circling. They speak of descent and ascent, of gates and crossings, of times when what is above touches what is below, of rules that govern who may pass, of rituals meant to reopen what has been sealed. Whether those gates are metaphorical, ritual, social, or something stranger, the literature refuses to let them go. There are ziggurats rising like stepped mountains out of flat land, and at their summits, small rooms that were maintained with care. There are foundation deposits, objects buried under corners for distant days. There are omen texts that treat the sky as an active surface of signs. There are lists of kings that stretch time into impossible lengths, then abruptly collapse into normal reigns after a flood. All of these elements can be explained in orthodox ways. They can also, if held in a different posture, begin to look like the residue of an old expectation. That knowledge came from elsewhere, that authority once walked closer, that a connection once existed, and then faded. The ground of Eridu holds its temples, one above another, and between the bricks lie the thin lines where air was trapped, where people worked and spoke and left. Above it all, the modern desert sites, quiet and bright by day, cold and featureless at night. The Abzu is not found with a spade. The Mi are not found as artifacts in a case. The Anunnaki do not appear as bones or metal. The record gives architecture and clay, and in the spaces between them, the mind is left with a question that cannot be excavated in the usual way. If something was given in the earliest memory of these cities, whether an ideology, a model of administration, a package of skills, or simply a new way of seeing the world, how would it look when preserved in myth? And how would it look when preserved in broken layers of mud brick and silt? The two archives, the clay of story and the clay of earth, do not align perfectly. That mismatch is where the unease lives. And somewhere inside that unease, the old words still wait, the ones that seem to say that what descends once may descend again, even if the form of descent remains disputed. In the 19th century, when the first great mounds of northern Mesopotamia were cut open with picks and baskets, the discoveries arrived like a sequence of doors. A wall, a corridor, a relief, a room sealed by collapse. And then, in the dim debris of palaces that had burned and fallen, clay tablets, thousands, stacked, scattered, fused by fire, preserved by the violence that destroyed them. At Nineveh, the collection associated with the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal is often called a library, but it was also an archive. Texts gathered from across an empire, copied and recopied, curated and stored. Many tablets were not composed there. Some were taken as tribute, some as spoils, some as scholarly acquisitions. It was a deliberate hoarding of memory, and the memory came to modern hands in a state that was never whole. The recovery itself was uneven. Tablets broke in the ground and broke again in transit. Pieces were separated from their original rooms. Labels like Nineveh can conceal multiple buildings, multiple layers, multiple moments of collapse. A tablet with no clear context can still be translated, but its voice becomes harder to place. The archive begins with a loss, and the loss keeps echoing. Even when the clay survives intact, it is not a page that yields easily. Cuneiform is light-sensitive. A sign can sharpen or vanish depending on the angle. A single missing wedge can turn one word into another. A surface can be worn smooth by time or by the fingertips of modern handling. Scribes made mistakes. Later, scribes copied those mistakes faithfully. And so the act of reading becomes a cautious choreography. Lamps moved, tablets rotated, lines compared against parallel versions, uncertainty admitted where certainty would be dishonest. That discipline matters when modern imaginations lean toward certainty. In editions of Mesopotamian texts, damaged passages are bracketed. Gaps remain gaps. Readings are marked as tentative. A broken edge becomes a silence that cannot be filled without confessing guesswork. The record grows quiet precisely where desire wants a declaration. The word Anunnaki lives inside that difficulty. It is not a single stable label that points to one fixed thing. In Sumerian and Akkadian literature, it can indicate a collective of major gods, a group associated with the underworld, or a formal class in a divine hierarchy. It appears in hymns and myths, in ritual lists, in learned compilations. Sometimes it is paired with the Igigi, another class of gods, and the contrast shifts depending on the text. The same term can be carried through centuries of copying, and the copying can preserve a category long after the lived meaning behind it has changed. This is why the idea of a clean warning is so hard to pin down. Mesopotamian literature contains expectations of divine judgment, restoration, and cosmic renewal. It also contains accounts of calamity, flood, plague, and the rise and fall of kingship. But the evidence is dispersed. It arrives as lines in omen series, as ritual instructions about opening what has been closed, as royal inscriptions that speak of a god's anger and return. Sometimes return can mean a cult statue brought back from captivity, the physical body of a god reinstalled in a temple after war. Sometimes it can mean a seasonal cycle, a festival, a reappearance in the heavens, a renewal of authority. The same verb can hold different weights, and the clay does not annotate its own metaphors. And then there is a fact that weighs on every modern reading. Far more tablets exist than have been fully published or even closely read. Museums hold vast trays of clay. Some are administrative records that repeat and still require careful work to be useful. Some are fragmentary, waiting for joins, two broken pieces reunited before the lines make sense. Some sit under old field numbers, photographed once a century ago, never collated again under better light. In many cases, the barrier is not a locked door, but time, a finite number of specialists, a finite number of hours, and an almost endless amount of clay. Other barriers are less gentle. The modern history of Mesopotamian artifacts includes looting, illicit markets, and disputed ownership. Tablets pulled from the ground without records lose the context that makes them speak clearly. Institutions, wary of legitimizing unprovenanced material, may delay or avoid publication. Wars and sanctions have interrupted excavation and scholarship, leaving collections scattered and documentation incomplete. In such conditions, silence can be ethical caution as much as concealment, and the archive becomes a field of absences that do not all have the same cause. The drama hides in the smallest details. Colophons, the note scribes sometimes wrote at the end, name the series, the tablet number, the copyist, the owner. They sometimes warn against theft. They sometimes admit that the original was old, damaged, difficult. A line can end with a phrase meaning simply broken or missing. It is an ancient acknowledgement of loss, and it feels uncomfortably modern. A broken tablet is not only a broken object, it is a broken chain of transmission. So the library is not a single revelation, but a long exposure of fragments. A story in one decade becomes a footnote in the next, revised by a new join, corrected by a better sign reading, reframed by a clearer understanding of genre. The archive keeps changing. And this instability is precisely what gives the old question its quiet power. If a clear proclamation had survived intact, it would be easy to catalog, easy to dismiss, easy to domesticate. But the surviving material often comes as half-sentences, ritual rubrics, titles without contents, quotations of older works that no longer exist. Somewhere, a corner intact on one tablet may complete the broken line of another. Somewhere, a join might turn a vague phrase into a concrete instruction. Somewhere, "they will return" might mean a statue carried back through a city gate, or it might mean something that no modern reader can quite translate into a comfortable category. The clay does not explain itself. It waits And so the modern scene returns to a drawer, a tray, a dim lamp angled low across a field of wedges. A tablet is turned slightly, and the signs sharpen, then fade. The oldest habit persists: to look closely, to copy carefully, to let uncertainty remain rather than force an answer. And beneath that discipline, the older tension continues to hum. If a warning was ever pressed into wet clay for distant days, how much of it is already in the archive, and how much still lies in the broken places, waiting for one more fragment to make it speak? Long after the first palace rooms were emptied of their clay, the tablets continued to travel, and their journeys became another kind of text, one written in shipping crates, accession numbers, auction catalogs, and court filings. The movement of Mesopotamian artifacts into collections in London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, and elsewhere created the modern map of the ancient archive. But it also scattered that archive into thousands of separated rooms, each with its own rules, its own lights, its own silences. A tablet can be safe in a museum and still be difficult to reach. Some collections are well photographed and catalogued, their inventories online, their fragments searchable by sign and shape. Other trays remain in storage for decades, awaiting staff time, funding, or a specialist with the right eye. In the best cases, the clay becomes more visible over time. In the worst cases, it becomes a shadowed thing, present, counted, but not truly read. The 20th and 21st centuries added another layer of absence. Looting does not just steal objects. It steals the surrounding story, the stratigraphy, the room, the floor level, the neighboring fragments that might have formed a join. A tablet dug up in secret enters the world without coordinates. It can still be translated, but it becomes unmoored. And when unprovenanced clay appears on the market, the scholarly response is often a quiet refusal, a reluctance to publish, to exhibit, to amplify, because doing so can encourage further loss. That restraint can look like suppression to someone who wants a single dramatic narrative. More often, it is institutional caution, and the cost of that caution is that genuine words can remain unread in plain sight. There are modern scandals that underline how fragile this landscape is. Public reports and legal cases have documented the trafficking of ancient Near Eastern artifacts, including cuneiform tablets, through dealers and private collections, and the subsequent returns of items to countries of origin. These events are not mysteries of hidden corridors. They are paperwork, seizures, restitution agreements, and the slow attempt to reverse damage that cannot truly be reversed. They also reveal how easily fragments can be separated from the contexts that make them speak honestly. A tablet without a find spot invites imaginative readings because the anchoring evidence is missing. The archive grows louder in speculation precisely when it grows quieter in verifiable detail. Meanwhile, the legitimate archive has its own quiet problems. Early excavations did not always preserve records the way modern archaeology tries to. Field notes can be incomplete, object numbers can shift between seasons, photographs can be unlabeled. In some cases, archives of excavation documentation have been lost through war, fire, reorganization, or simple neglect. The result is a strange inversion. Clay that survived 3 millennia can outlast the paper that recorded where it lay. The sense of an erased chapter does not require an intentional eraser. It can be produced by a century of small fractures. A shipment split between institutions, a box misfiled, A tray moved during renovation. A fragment cataloged under the wrong series title. A set of negatives never digitized. A scholar's unpublished notes left in an estate. Each loss is small and the cumulative effect is enormous. The archive becomes an ocean of material with pockets of clarity and wide zones of fog. Yet there is also a countercurrent, the slow, careful labor of reconnecting what has been scattered. In recent decades, large digital initiatives have made many texts more accessible. Photographs, transliterations, translations, sign lists, and concordances gathered into searchable corpora. This work does not create certainty, but it creates the conditions for better uncertainty. When a fragment in one museum can be compared against another fragment on the other side of the world, joins become possible. Parallel versions can be collated. A line that once seemed unique can be placed inside a known composition. A rare word can be recognized because it appears elsewhere. The archive begins to behave less like a set of isolated relics and more like what it always was, a network of copied knowledge. This is where the strange miracle of the join enters. A fragment in the British Museum can match the broken edge of a piece in the Louvre. A tablet in Berlin can complete a line missing in a copy in Istanbul. A crack in a surface can align like a fingerprint across two collections that never intended to speak to each other. When such joins are made, the effect is not theatrical. It is almost tender. A broken sentence becomes a full thought again. A damaged colophon reveals a tablet number. A composition sequence becomes clearer. The archive breathes. But joins also complicate the narrative appetite. They do not tend to reveal a single secret. More often, they reveal genre. A line that sounded like a warning becomes, in context, a ritual rubric. A phrase that sounded like an eyewitness report becomes, in context, a learned literary device. A claim that seemed like a historical timeline becomes, in context, a traditional number pattern used to signal deep antiquity. The deeper the archive becomes, the more it resists being reduced to a single modern category. This resistance is not a disappointment. It is a clue. Mesopotamian scribes lived inside a world where divine presence could be spoken of in multiple registers at once. A god could be a force, a person, a statue, a star, a name in a list, a sign on a seal, a patron of a city, a legal authority invoked in a contract. The same deity could be treated as intimately local and cosmically distant. The same story could be told as ritual instruction and as entertainment and as philosophical reflection. The archive keeps all of these voices, and it rarely labels them for modern convenience. It is in that complexity that the modern question about visitors finds both fuel and friction. When a text describes a god descending, it can be read alongside the architecture of high platforms and the maintenance of summit rooms. When a ritual describes opening a gate, it can be read alongside the administrative reality that temple doors were opened and closed each day, that spaces were restricted, that access was controlled. When an omen text ties a celestial sign to political upheaval, it can be read as early astronomy, as divination, as sociology, or as a memory of earlier fears. None of these readings can simply erase the others. The archive does not collapse into a single answer. It accumulates possibilities. And there is another difficulty that cannot be ignored: the long shadow of modern interpreters who have pushed the material beyond what it can support. Some popular authors have claimed to translate tablets in ways that specialists dispute, sometimes sharply, pointing out errors in grammar and the tendency to bend ambiguous lines into predetermined stories. This debate is publicly visible, and it matters because it shapes the way non-specialists approach the clay. The existence of disputed interpretations does not prove a hidden truth. It proves that the material is potent enough to be fought over. It also proves that the simplest guardrail is still the oldest one. Rid what is actually there, and mark what is not. So the archive sits between two temptations. One is to treat every line as pure metaphor and close the case too quickly. The other is to treat every line as literal reportage and force the clay to become a modern genre it was never designed to be. Between these extremes is the slow discipline of comparison. Text against text, object against context, myth against ritual, poetry against bureaucracy. It is a method that does not thrill quickly, but it endures. Somewhere in that method, the old fear returns in a new shape. If the story of the Anunnaki was, at least in part, a way to describe order, who rules, who serves, who decides, who returns, then the most unsettling possibility is not that the tablets hide an alien timetable. It is that they preserve a human obsession with authority so deep that it can survive any change of empire, any change of language, any change of god names. A hierarchy that can be rewritten as theology, then as politics, then as fate, then as history. And yet, in the quiet drawers of museums, among the fragments not yet joined, there remain lines that still cannot be placed with confidence, titles without surviving bodies, references to older tablets that no one has found, colophons that point to series now missing. The archive, for all its mass, still contains gaps shaped like books that once existed. In those book-shaped silences, the question persists with stubborn softness. If the clay was meant to remember something specific, something more than metaphor, what would it take for one of those missing works to surface intact? And what would it do to the balance of every careful reading? There are times in the Mesopotamian record when protection looks less like a wall and more like a procedure performed in silence. A building rises from mud brick in a landscape that can drown it in a season, and the builders treat the corners as if they are vulnerable in ways weather cannot explain. Under thresholds and into foundations, small figures are buried, human forms, bird-headed forms, and figures wrapped in the skin of a fish. These objects were not made to be admired. They were made to remain unseen, to hold a line where a doorway meets the dark. Around these buried guardians, a name returns in later Akkadian and Babylonian traditions: Apkallu, the sages. They are linked especially to Enki, called Ea in Akkadian, whose domain was the deep freshwater abyss beneath the earth. In reliefs and seal imagery, a familiar figure appears, a human body with a fish cloak draped over the shoulders, the fish's head perched above the figure's own, the fish's body hanging down the back like a second skin. The image repeats across centuries with a steadiness that feels almost administrative, as if the figure is an office, not merely an idea. The written tradition surrounding these sages is layered and uneasy. Some list name 7 Apkallu before the flood, attached to a time when kingship was said to have been lowered from heaven and when reigns stretch into lengths that cannot be reconciled with ordinary human lives. After the flood, other sages appear, and the texts sometimes mark them as human rather than semi-divine. The categories do not settle into a clean system. The record gives names, fragments of lineage, and then it falls quiet, leaving later copyists to preserve the shape of a tradition without its full explanation. A later witness survives in another language. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the Hellenistic period, preserves the story of a teacher from the sea, a being he calls Oannes. In his account, this figure rises from the water and teaches writing, calculation, agriculture, and civic order, then returns to the sea at night. It reads like a memory shaped into symbol, or a symbol told as memory. Yet it still echoes the older Mesopotamian habit of explaining sudden knowledge through an outsider who arrives, instructs, and withdraws. Archaeology does not confirm the instructor. It confirms the practice. In Assyrian and Babylonian contexts, excavations have uncovered protective figurines and deposits placed in buildings, sometimes alongside cuneiform ritual instructions. These rites specify placements, figures set into corners, under floors, at doorways, where boundaries are most vulnerable. The language can sound procedural, like an operation meant to stabilize a space and prevent intrusion. Illness, misfortune, hostile forces. The kind of danger that enters without sound and only reveals itself after it has already settled in. That functional use changes the weight of the sages. A myth can be recited and remain safely in the air. A figurine buried under a threshold is different. It is a decision made by someone who expects consequences. It suggests a world where danger does not need to be visible in order to be treated as real, and where knowledge functions like a repeatable technique. The rite must be performed in the right order, with the right materials, at the right points in the architecture, as if correctness itself is a form of defense. The fish cloak is a quiet provocation because the earliest cities were born in wetlands. Southern Mesopotamia is a place where canals are lifelines and floods are erasures. In one grounded reading, the fish is simply the riverlands made sacred. The sage wearing the fish becomes an emblem of water's primacy, a reminder that urban life rests on managing an element that never truly belongs to human control. But the same image can also feel strangely occupational. A cloak is worn, tools are carried. Many fish-cloaked figures are shown holding a small bucket and a cone-shaped object, and the action implied is consistent enough to invite the sense of a practiced task repeated at the borders of life. In some depictions, the cone is pressed toward a doorway or a stylized tree, and the bucket is held as if it contains water or a prepared substance. The common explanation keeps this in the realm of purification, and the wider corpus of Mesopotamian ritual makes that a steady anchor. Still, the insistence on the same posture, the same tools, and the same placement at boundaries can feel like a practiced task taught and retaught, meant to be executed correctly rather than simply believed. A different temptation appears in modern retellings, to rename these figures as watchers, a term that belongs more securely to later Jewish apocalyptic literature than to the cuneiform sources themselves. The mismatch matters. When a later word is fitted too tightly onto older clay, it can flatten older meanings and produce false certainty. Yet the impulse behind the label lingers. The record repeatedly shows guardians set at edges, and it repeatedly treats knowledge as something that must be stewarded when presence is absent. The division between before the flood sages and later human sages deepens the sense of a break. In several Mesopotamian narratives, the oldest age is a time of closeness. Gods debate, decide, and act in a way that implies presence. Later texts keep the same divine names but shift contact toward omens and rites, as if the direct line has thinned. The sages stand on that boundary. They are instructors in the old age, guardians in the later age, and their role is to mediate what cannot be held directly anymore. Some scholars treat the Apkallu as an origin story shaped by historical acceleration, complex administration, and writing taking recognizable form in the late 4th millennium BCE, unevenly and quickly across sites. Others emphasize the ritual dimension and see the sages as protective archetypes deployed at the edges of lived space. The archive permits both readings, and it does not choose between them. What remains in the clay and in the placement of small bodies beneath thresholds is an impression of stewardship. A house is stable if its edges are sealed. A city endures if its measures are maintained. Under the floor, the figurines face outward in darkness, as if waiting for a pressure that once entered through the same boundary, and might, according to older warnings, learn the way back. A different kind of vigilance lived on clay as well, thin lines pressed into wet earth that hardened into a permanent way of watching. Not watching with eyes raised to a sky full of stars, but watching with lists and thresholds and conditional phrases. If this appears, then that follows. If the moon is bitten, if the sun grows dim, if Venus rises too early or too late, if a halo holds the moon like a ring, if lightning strikes without rain. In the later Mesopotamian centuries, attention becomes a discipline, and that discipline leaves behind a literature that feels less like prayer and more like a system of alerts. The most famous name for this is a title that is also a sentence, Enuma Anu Enlil, when Anu and Enlil. It refers to an extensive series of omen tablets that collected signs from the sky and their predicted consequences on Earth. The series itself is older than any one library. It was copied, edited, and recopied across centuries, shifting language as empires shifted, but keeping its underlying intent. The sky was treated as a surface of writing. The task was to read it without mistake, to keep the chain unbroken from sign to interpretation to action. In the Neo-Assyrian period, this work becomes visible in a way that feels almost modern because letters survive. In Nineveh, in the 7th century BCE, scholars attached to the Assyrian court wrote to the king about what they had seen in the night sky. They reported eclipses. They argued about interpretations. They recommended rituals to deflect danger. The tone can be surprisingly practical, not sentimental, not lyrical. It is a bureaucratic voice describing cosmic unease, the way a state might respond when its early warning systems flash. Some of those tablets and letters ended up in the royal collections associated with Ashurbanipal, and later they were buried in a kind of catastrophe that preserved them, the destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Fire can erase, but it can also bake. Clay hardened. Fragments collapsed into darkness and waited. When 19th century excavations brought them out again, the modern world inherited not only epics and hymns, but the working paperwork of a civilization that believed the sky could announce a coming shift long before it arrived. It is in that paperwork that the idea of return changes its shape. In the earliest stories, return can sound like a promised arrival of named powers. In the omen literature and the letters, return looks more like a cycle, a pattern, a recurrence, a sign that the old forces are moving again. The word does not have to be spoken for the sensation to be there, that something above has resumed a sequence that once mattered, and that an attentive city must respond as if the old apparatus of heaven has begun to turn. The problem is that the omen system is both intensely detailed and stubbornly opaque to modern confidence. The same sign can be read in more than one way. Different scholars disagreed, and their disagreements were preserved. The sky itself is not a clean text. A lunar eclipse does not carry a label. It arrives, it darkens, it passes, and then human beings argue about what it meant. The archive holds both the wish for certainty and the constant failure to achieve it. Certain texts stand out as if they were meant to anchor time. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, preserved within later copies of a wider series, records the risings and settings of Venus over a span of years and links those appearances to omens. Scholars have debated for generations how to pin those observations to an absolute chronology, because the tablet's transmission is complex and the copies are late. Even so, it reveals a mind trained to treat the planet as a clock, as a returning signal whose deviations might mean something for kings, harvests, and war. The record implies that repeatability itself was sacred. If Venus returned in a different way, then something in the order of things had shifted. Another kind of compilation, MUL.APIN, gathers stars and constellations, risings and settings, lengths of days, paths of the moon. It reads like a handbook. It is not a single discovery frozen in time, but an accumulation of observation and tradition. It suggests that the sky was mapped not only for awe, but for use. The constellations become a grid. The horizon becomes a measuring instrument. The night becomes an archive that never burns. And then there are the astronomical diaries from Babylon, later in time, where scribes recorded nightly observations alongside market prices and political events. The tone is plain, almost indifferent, as if the sky and the economy belong in the same ledger. Jupiter's movement is noted in the same breath as the price of barley. This is not poetry. It is monitoring. It is the habit of a city that knows it can be surprised and tries to reduce surprise by writing everything down. If this is only religion, it is a religion with receipts. If it is only superstition, it is a superstition organized like a science. And if some modern readers want to see in it the shadow of something else, a long-lived program of readiness for the return of powerful visitors, then the archive offers both encouragement and refusal. Encouragement because the procedures look like preparedness rather than spontaneous myth-making. Refusal because the same procedures can be explained through politics and fear and the ordinary human need to tame uncertainty. Even the kings behaved as if the system mattered. When scholars warned of danger from an eclipse, there were times when a substitute king ritual was performed, a temporary stand-in placed on the throne, absorbing the omen's threat, so the real king could survive the predicted blow. The practice is attested in Mesopotamian sources and has been studied as a strategy for managing omen anxiety within a state apparatus. It shows a government willing to treat celestial signs as actionable intelligence and willing to spend resources on symbolic engineering meant to alter the outcome. The ritual dimension folds back into the architecture of sealed places. Texts about purifications, protections, and boundary rights imply that the dangerous moment is not the sign itself, but what follows it. A gate is opened, a line is crossed, and influence arrives. The same imagination that placed protective figurines under thresholds also placed danger in the interval between a cosmic signal and the response to it. and in the letters to kings, the fear is not abstract. It is directed. It is targeted. It can be named as the king's enemy, the land, the palace. The sky's message is always translated into consequence. Yet the archive is not whole. It never is. Omen series were copied from older exemplars, and scribes sometimes noted when lines were broken, when the original was unclear, when a portion was missing. Libraries were damaged, dispersed, reorganized. Tablets traveled through conquest and trade and looting and museum acquisition. Some pieces are known only because later texts refer to them by title. The record hints at a larger body of material that once existed, more complete sequences, more explicit explanations, and then the trail fades into gaps that cannot be filled. Those gaps invite a certain kind of midnight thought. If the system was meant to preserve readiness for a true return of gods, of visitors, of a lost authority, then missing tablets matter. A missing list is a missing warning. A broken line is a broken instruction. But there is another explanation that sits beside it, equally heavy. Empires collapse, archives scatter, and human memory is always incomplete, even when it is written in clay. Still, the sensation persists. In these texts, the heavens are not simply admired. They are watched for deviations, for appointed patterns, for the kind of recurrence that announces a shift in the rules. The city waits in its own way, by counting, by comparing, by filing observations beside prices and politics, as if the only defense against what might return is to keep the night under continuous record, until the sky offers a sign that cannot be argued away. What survives from Mesopotamia often survives by accident, and what is lost is rarely lost cleanly. Clay is durable, but archives are not. A library can endure in a buried room for 25 centuries and then vanish in a single afternoon once it is lifted into daylight, handled, sold, dispersed, mislabeled, or simply never recorded properly. The ancient scribes feared flood and fire and the slow rot of time, but they could not have predicted the modern forces that would thin their record. The appetite of collectors, the speed of war, the bureaucracy of borders, the quiet disappearance of objects into private rooms where no scholar is permitted to look. The path from a trench in Iraq to a museum case in London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, or Philadelphia is often described as scholarship, and sometimes it is. Excavations in the 19th and early 20th centuries did produce foundational knowledge, and some of the objects removed from the ground were at least catalogued, conserved, and made available for study. But the same era also built a market. The same discoveries that made translation possible also made possession valuable. A tablet could be a line of history to one person and a commodity to another. The record did not merely thin, it fractured. A single cuneiform tablet is rarely dramatic on its own. It is small. It sits in the palm like a broken piece of brick. Its power is in the way it belongs to a set, a shelf, a sequence, a classroom exercise in a temple school, a bundle tied together and stored for quick reference. When tablets are separated from their archaeological context, they lose their neighbors. They become stray sentences with no paragraph. Even a clear translation cannot restore what the original arrangement provided. Which texts were kept together, which were copied from which were treated as authoritative, which were considered dangerous or restricted or merely obsolete. Modern scholarship knows this, and modern scholarship is haunted by it. The most careful work depends on provenance, where an object was found, in what layer, in what room, beside what other objects. But an enormous number of tablets circulating today arrived with no such story, only a dealer's claim and a vague geography. From Iraq, from the Near East, from an old collection. The phrasing is a kind of fog. In that fog, it becomes hard to speak about completeness with any honest confidence. A list is missing, a line is missing, a whole genre may be missing, not because it never existed, but because it fell into the wrong channel of modern history. The looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in 2003 became a symbol of this fracture. Images circulated of emptied cases and broken storage rooms. Thousands of objects were taken, and among them were cuneiform tablets and seals. Portable, easy to hide, easy to sell, difficult to track once separated from their records. Some items were recovered over the years through international efforts, but recovery cannot reverse dispersion. Once an object has been removed from its archive, its silence changes. It becomes not only lost from a shelf, but lost from a system. This is not an accusation against any single person or nation. It is a description of a pattern that has repeated across centuries. Tablets were moved in antiquity as well, carried as booty, copied and recopied, rehoused in new libraries. The difference is that ancient scribes tended to preserve the logic of collections even as they relocated them. Modern dispersal often shatters the logic entirely. A legal case might return an object to a museum, but not to its original room, not to its original bundle, not to the set of related texts that once explained its purpose. In recent years, the public record has caught occasional glimpses of this shadow economy in moments when it breaks into daylight. Cases involving the illicit importation of cuneiform tablets into the United States have been documented in court filings and press reports, including material associated with the so-called Green Collection and the 2017 settlement involving Hobby Lobby. The details are legal, procedural, modern, but the consequence is ancient. Tablets separated from their context, treated as artifacts first and texts second, handled as objects of possession rather than nodes in a living archive of meaning. The scholars who work on Mesopotamia live with a peculiar tension. They need access to tablets, and access can depend on institutions that hold them. Museums can be generous, but they can also be constrained by funding, politics, conservation limits, and the simple fact that storage rooms are not public libraries. Some collections remain only partially cataloged. Some tablets are published in hand copies that preserve signs but not the full physicality of the object. Some are known only by inventory number and a brief description. The text exists, and yet it is out of reach, sealed behind an ordinary kind of silence. Even when access is granted, time is limited. A scholar might have a few days with a group of tablets, photographed under strict conditions, trying to catch faint signs worn by centuries of handling before modern hands ever touched them. A single wedge, a small angle, can change a word, and a word can change a narrative. The smallest uncertainty becomes a fault line. This is how myths grow large in the modern imagination, not because scholars are careless, but because the archive is incomplete and the public hunger for a complete story is relentless. The consequences are especially sharp for the question that keeps returning like a low pulse. Were these texts only myth, or were they memory shaped into ritual form? The answer depends in part on seeing the full range of genres side by side, royal inscriptions beside administrative lists, hymns beside legal contracts, omen series beside astronomical observations, ritual instructions beside private letters. When those categories are separated by modern ownership, interpretation begins to drift. A story can look stranger than it is when its administrative grounding is missing. A ritual can look purely symbolic when the technical texts that accompanied it are hidden. The archive does not simply provide evidence, it provides the controls that keep interpretation from floating away. There is also a quieter kind of disappearance, one that looks respectable. Tablets can be lost in the sense that they sit uncatalogued in boxes for decades, not stolen, not sold, simply waiting for time and funding and the right specialist. A museum can hold tens of thousands of cuneiform objects, and only a portion may be fully published. The rest remain like an unread library, present but silent, their contents unknown to the wider world. In that kind of silence, any claim about what Mesopotamia said has to be spoken with restraint, because the possibility always exists that a tablet in a drawer complicates the conclusion. This is where the old motifs begin to look less like metaphors and more like accurate descriptions of how knowledge behaves. Sealed spaces, missing records, doors that do not open, rooms that are closed not by priestly decree, but by inventory backlog, by legal dispute, by political instability, by the sheer weight of material that outlasts the capacity to read it. The ancient world becomes, in a strange way, contemporary, a civilization whose most important messages might still be waiting in storage, in private hands, in the back rooms of institutions, in places where the catalog number exists, but the translation does not. And if the old question about return is kept alive by anything, it may be kept alive by this modern condition of partial access. A return does not have to mean the arrival of beings from the sky. It can mean the return of a line of text into scholarship, the return of a missing fragment into its proper sequence, the return of context to an orphaned tablet. Yet the more that possibility is considered, the more another thought slips in beneath it, quieter, harder to dismiss. If there are tablets still unread, still unseen, still unreported, then there may be passages that modern debates have never had to face, sentences that were copied and preserved for reasons the archive has not yet revealed, waiting in some sealed place to tilt the balance of interpretation, if they are ever allowed to speak at all. Even when a tablet is safe, catalogued, and placed beneath glass, the question of what it says does not become simple. The signs are small, the wedges shallow, and the language that carries them is not one language at all, but a layered stack of tongues and scripts, changing over millennia, borrowed, adapted, standardized, and then broken into regional habits that can be hard to separate. A single impression can belong to Sumerian or Akkadian, to a liturgical register, or a legal one, to a school exercise, or a line copied from a revered old composition. The clay may endure, but meaning is fragile. The modern reading of cuneiform began with a kind of double vision, the realization that an ancient script could be approached like a system rather than a mystery. In the 19th century, the great multilingual inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persian kings, especially the Behistun inscription, gave scholars an anchor, a set of parallel texts that could be compared and tested. Henry Rawlinson's work is often named here, and so is Edward Hincks, and others who argued over sign values and grammar with the grim patience of people who know the archive will not forgive impatience. The process produced a method: hypothesis, comparison, revision, and the slow accumulation of certainty where certainty was possible. Yet that certainty is uneven. The later Akkadian texts, especially those from first millennium libraries, can be read with far more confidence than the earliest Sumerian compositions, not because the early world was stranger, but because the data are thinner and the writing less standardized. Even in the best preserved tablet, a line can be broken at the edge. A sign can be worn, blurred into a shape that could be one of several possibilities. A scribe can choose an unusual spelling. A later copyist can misunderstand an older phrase. The text, written to preserve, carries within it the marks of transmission, and transmission always changes what it carries. In that space where method meets fracture, modern disagreements gather. One group of specialists will read a sign as one value. Another will argue it must be a different one based on context, parallel passages, or an earlier version of the same composition. A term translated as heaven in one edition might be rendered as sky in another, and the difference can feel small until it begins to touch the larger question of what the line implies. A phrase translated as descended might also mean went down, and the direction matters when the imagination is already leaning toward ladders, stairways, gates. The old materials invite that leaning because the writing itself is obsessed with boundaries. It speaks constantly of above and below, of doors, thresholds, and crossings. But these are also the natural metaphors of a river world, where the horizon is wide and the sky is heavy, where storms arrive like armies, where the marshes hide paths and erase them. In such a world, from heaven can be a religious phrase, a political phrase, a poetic phrase, or all three at once. The text does not always separate them. It lets them overlap because overlap is part of its power. This is where the public often enters the story with a different hunger than the specialists. The public wants a single reading, a single verdict. But Assyriology, when it is honest, tends to offer something else. A best reading with footnotes, an interpretation with margins full of alternatives, a translation that carries in its seams the awareness that a single wedge could change a sentence, and a sentence could change a whole argument. That honesty is not always what travels farthest. In the late 20th century, popular works began to present strong, confident interpretations of the Anunnaki as literal visitors, framed as a correction to mainstream scholarship. The name that appears repeatedly in that realm is Zecharia Sitchin, whose books reached wide audiences and shaped modern imagination about Nibiru, about long cycles, about texts as disguised technical records. Specialists in the languages have long criticized his readings, pointing to errors in sign values, grammar, and the way ambiguous terms were pushed toward a predetermined conclusion. That criticism is part of the public record, and it has been repeated for decades. Yet even that controversy does not erase the underlying reason it found a home. The texts themselves, in places, do read with a bureaucratic clarity that feels unusual for mythology, and they do preserve a layered cosmology that is difficult to map cleanly onto later religious categories. There is a genuine fascination in the way Mesopotamian literature mixes lists and hymns, reports and rituals, measurements and metaphors. A person can sense, even without endorsing any extreme reading, why the old clay invites the question of whether the line between myth and memory was always as firm as later traditions prefer it to be. The most careful scholars tend to resist that firm line in a different way. They may insist, correctly, that divine figures in Mesopotamian texts are not treated as aliens and that the language does not demand such a reading. But they will also acknowledge that ancient people did not write religion and politics and science into separate shelves. Astronomical observations sit beside omen lists. Medical recipes sit beside incantations. Royal ideology borrows the language of the gods, and the language of the gods borrows the tone of administration. The archive is a single body, and its organs are intertwined. Even the word Anunnaki shifts with time and context. In some periods, it can refer broadly to a group of major deities. In other contexts, it can be bound to the underworld. In yet others, it becomes part of a poetic register that signals authority and age, rather than a fixed roster of named beings. A reader looking for a single definition will be disappointed. A reader willing to accept overlapping meanings will find the term behaving like a living thing. The same is true of Nibiru. In some texts, it appears as a celestial marker, a crossing point, a term linked to the logic of the sky rather than a hidden world. In others, it is associated with Marduk, a sign of order, a stabilizing point in a cosmic story. The later desire to make it a planet with a long orbit is not demanded by the ancient evidence as most specialists read it. But the ancient evidence also does not always explain itself in the way modern questions want. It leaves room, and room invites occupation. There is a deeper tension here, quieter than the disputes over any one author or any one term. The tension is between the human need for a clean narrative and the archive's refusal to provide one. Mesopotamian literature is not a single book. It is a field of fragments, copied and recopied, altered by city rivalries, by theological shifts, by political reforms, by the habits of scribal schools. A text from Nippur can preserve a different emphasis than a text from Uruk. A hymn can be reworked so that a local god becomes the center of what was once a shared story. Even the same epic can survive in multiple versions, not because someone forged it, but because in the ancient world, copying was also commentary. And so the modern reader stands in a strange place. The clay speaks, and the clay hesitates. It offers a world where gods can be addressed like officials, where decisions are made in councils, where decrees feel like administrative orders. It offers a world where the sky is read with intense seriousness, where long cycles are named and counted. It offers, too, a long shadow of absence, as if something once present withdrew and left behind procedures for maintaining a relationship that later generations could no longer guarantee. Whether that shadow belongs to changing theology, to political collapse, to the gradual loss of older ritual competence, or to something else that the record no longer contains, is not easily settled. The archive provides arguments, not verdicts. It supplies methods, not assurances. And when the eye drifts from the translated line back to the tiny wedges pressed into clay, the feeling returns that the most important feature of these texts is not what they prove, but what they preserve. A disciplined uncertainty, carefully copied, waiting for a missing fragment to return and change the sentence again. A tablet without a provenience is a voice without a room. The signs may still be read, the language may still be parsed, but the silence around it becomes part of the meaning. Where was it found? In which level? Beside what other objects? In a temple archive, a palace library, a private house, a schoolroom where apprentices practiced their wedges until the clay grew tired of correction. The smallest context can change the weight of a line. Without it, even a careful translation carries a faint dizziness, like trying to remember a dream after waking, when the images remain vivid, but the place where they happened has vanished. For the study of Mesopotamia, this is not an abstract worry. It is a bruise the field has carried for generations, made darker by the last decades. The great archaeological discoveries of the 19th and early 20th centuries created collections in London, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, Baghdad, Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere. And the movement of objects across borders has always been wrapped in politics and power. But more recently, the loss has taken a different form. Not the slow drift of artifacts into foreign cabinets, but sudden dispersal, theft, and the kind of chaos that scatters archives into the market, where they are stripped of story and sold as isolated wonders. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, founded in the early 20th century, held an irreplaceable concentration of objects from Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian sites. In April 2003, amid the collapse of order after the invasion of Iraq, the museum was looted. The images traveled far: empty cases, smashed locks, storerooms disturbed, a national archive treated as spoil. Some objects were recovered over time through seizures and returns, and others remain missing. The loss was not only of objects, but of a kind of continuity, a sense that the ancient record had a stable home in the modern landscape that gave it birth. Even when items return, they rarely return whole in the way they left. An artifact can be recovered, but its chain of custody is broken. Records may be incomplete. Photographs may be missing. In the case of tablets, a missing corner can matter less than a missing label. A shelf mark, a find spot, an excavation notebook entry. These are the thin threads that connect an object to a room to a building to a city, and a city to a century. When those threads snap, the object becomes both more portable and more opaque. There is also the quieter damage that does not require a dramatic raid. Illegal excavation, looting at sites, has bled context away from the ground for years. In southern Iraq, where ancient cities rise as low tells from flat plains, a looter's pit can erase stratigraphy as effectively as a fire. A tablet pulled from earth without documentation loses the very thing that makes it most valuable to history: the ability to be placed inside a sequence. It becomes a text floating in time. This floating has consequences that reach directly into the kind of questions that gather around the Anunnaki and returns. Prophecy texts, omen series, astronomical diaries, ritual instructions, these are genres that depend on setting. A line that sounds like a warning can be an excerpt from a school exercise, copied because it was famous, not because it was urgent. An omen that speaks of a king falling can be a generic pattern rather than a targeted forecast. A ritual that describes opening a gate can be liturgical language for communication with a deity, not a blueprint for anything mechanical. Context does not resolve these questions automatically, but it narrows the possibilities and gives them shape. In the absence of context, interpretation becomes vulnerable to gravity from the present. Modern anxieties and modern desires can pull on ancient lines until they curve. An age hungry for signals may search the clay for signals. A time accustomed to bureaucracy may recognize bureaucracy and mistake it for familiarity. A world fluent in technology may hear technology where the ancient writer intended divine order, or may hear divine order where an ancient writer intended political metaphor. The record does not prevent projection, it only resists it, and resistance requires patience. At the same time, the modern world has built new kinds of rooms for these voices. Digital initiatives have gathered cuneiform texts into searchable corpora, photographing tablets, transcribing signs, linking transliterations to museum numbers. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and the Open Richly Annotated Cuneiform Corpus have made it possible to move through thousands of lines without crossing a museum threshold. The archive, in a sense, has grown a second body, a shadow body made of pixels and metadata, less vulnerable to theft, more vulnerable to error, but capable of bringing distant fragments into conversation. This is not a simple rescue. A photograph can preserve a surface, but it can also flatten it. A transliteration can standardize a sign, but it can also conceal uncertainty in the choice of a value. A database entry can repeat a cataloging mistake for years before it is corrected. The digital archive helps, but it also reminds that the work is never finished. A sign read one way in 2005 can be revised in 2025. A join, two fragments recognized as belonging to the same tablet, can suddenly restore a missing passage and shift the tone of a whole composition. The record is alive, and it changes in the very act of being watched. There is another layer of silence that hangs around some of the most evocative claims, the difference between what is translated and what is published. Not everything in museum storerooms is fully studied. Not every tablet has been photographed, copied, transliterated, and translated. Collections are vast, staff and funding are finite. Scholars specialize, and time is narrow. Some texts remain in drawers because they are fragmentary, because they are repetitive, because they are difficult, because there are always other priorities. This is not a conspiracy. It is the ordinary limitation of human attention. And yet, for those who carry the old question, what if something important is still waiting, ordinary limitation can feel like another kind of sealed door. A sealed door does not need a lock to function. Sometimes it is sealed by language, Sumerian compositions preserved only in broken school copies. Sometimes by script, tablets written in a hand that is hard to read, signs so tight they look like woven cloth. Sometimes by genre, omen series where meaning is cumulative across hundreds of lines, each line, dull alone, dangerous only as part of an entire system. Sometimes by politics, regions where excavation is difficult, where permits are complex, where security is fragile, where a tell cannot be safely opened without risking the living people around it. The ancient world itself understood this problem of sealing and unsealing. It hid texts in foundations, stored tablets in temple rooms, copied compositions into school tablets so that even if a library burned, a memory might survive elsewhere in the hands of students. It built redundancy into its knowledge as if it expected loss. It also accepted that loss would happen anyway. So many colophons mark damage, missing lines, broken endings. The writers knew the archive could be wounded. They wrote through that knowledge, and in the modern era, the wound is visible. There are tablets in private hands whose find spots will never be known. There are fragments in collections that have not yet been joined to their other halves. There are storerooms whose full contents are still being cataloged. There are sites beneath modern cities and beneath shifting rivers and beneath reclaimed marshland, places that may hold sealed caches or may hold nothing at all, or may hold only ordinary records that become extraordinary simply because they survived. In such a landscape, any talk of warning must remain careful. The clay speaks, but it does not speak evenly. Some voices are loud because they were discovered early and studied often. Others are quiet because they are still in shadow. A pattern can be real, or it can be an artifact of what happened to survive and be read. And yet the possibility remains that somewhere in a storeroom drawer, or in a box of uncatalogued fragments, or in a tell that has not been safely opened, a small wedge-marked line waits that will not answer the old question, but will sharpen it, by adding one more detail that refuses to be put back to sleep. A final quietness settles over the clay, not because the questions have been answered, but because the questions have learned how to live inside uncertainty without tearing it open. In museum light, a tablet looks almost ordinary, a small rectangle, the color of dried earth, its surface crowded with tiny wedges that once yielded under a reed stylus. It is easy to forget that every mark began as pressure on something soft, a hand, a moment, a choice to set a memory into matter before it escaped. The earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia was practical. Rations, inventories, accounts of grain and labor, numbers arranged like small fences against disorder. Then, almost without changing tools, the same medium began to hold larger things: hymns, myths, omens, rituals, star lists, and king lists. Clay did not distinguish between the mundane and the vast. A ledger and a cosmology could share the same disciplined handwriting. That habit alone is part of the mystery. A civilization treating the invisible with the same seriousness as the measurable. It is in that overlap that the Anunnaki remain difficult. In surviving texts, they are a category rather than a single, stable roster. Sometimes they are the great gods whose assembly decides fates. Sometimes they are invoked as a collective weight, the court that hears petitions and issues decrees. Sometimes the boundaries blur under later retellings, translations, and recompositions, as Sumerian compositions were adapted into Akkadian, and later Babylonian and Assyrian traditions revised and recontextualized older material for new audiences. That layering is why the notion of visitors cannot be handled like a switch. The text described descent and ascent, gates and thresholds, divine meals, councils, genealogies, assigned domains. They also describe metaphors with a literal confidence that can resemble a report. Ancient cosmologies were spatial and procedural. Sky and earth and underworld were not abstractions. They were domains with roots, laws, and border crossings. A descent could be a ritual act. It could be a seasonal pattern. It could also be a poetic way of naming political change. And still certain details remain stubborn. The way temple life is documented as provisioning, bread, beer, oil, textiles, often reads in the same tone as palace logistics, as if hospitality were part of a system, not only a symbol. The way the Sumerian king list stitches mythic time to historical time without hiding the seam can feel like a deliberate insistence that both belong on the same page. The way later rituals labor to reopen channels that earlier stories treat as already open suggests a remembered closure, a sense of access reduced. The modern impulse is to resolve tension by choosing a single frame and locking everything inside it, either religion, therefore symbol, therefore harmless, or technology, therefore literal, therefore exhilarating. But the ancient record resists that clean choice. In Mesopotamia, religion was also governance, economy, architecture, and law. A god was also a patron with land, labor, and grain, a name that could authorize an oath, a presence that could be negotiated with through ritual and politics alike. So when a text speaks of a council deciding humanity's fate, it may echo the lived reality of councils deciding the fate of cities. When it speaks of kingship being lowered from heaven, it may capture the shock of centralized authority arriving as if from above, replacing local custom with decree. When it speaks of wisdom being given, it may preserve the memory of knowledge transfer across networks that the later world could no longer trace, a sudden concentration of skills and systems that felt like a gift from beyond the human horizon. In the end, what may be most reliable is the human act that produced the record. Someone believed that writing could carry something across disaster. Someone believed a future reader might exist. Tablets were copied, recopied, repaired, and shelved. Some were placed into foundations as if time were a corridor that could be walked in one direction. Others were filed and cataloged, and then buried under collapse when cities fell. The motive is visible even when the meaning is not, to keep a line intact when buildings fall and languages change. Over the old cities, the night sky still turns with the same slow architecture the scribes watched. Planets wander, stars keep their places, and only the long drift of precession betrays itself beyond a single life. The tablets sit in drawers and cases, their wedges holding on. The ziggurats remain as low mountains of brick and wind, their stairways eroded into angles that still point upward. Rivers shift course. Kingdoms rise and break. Tongues change. Yet impressions pressed into wet clay remain legible. If the Anunnaki were only gods, then they were gods whose stories carried unusually dense procedural detail, and that detail still deserves contemplation. If they were something closer to visitors, then the record is not a clean report, but a translation of an encounter into religious language, and the nature of that translation remains disputed. If they were both memory and metaphor, institution and imagination, authority and awe braided together, then the most honest stance is to hold the questions without demanding a verdict. The clay does not deliver a final answer. It delivers endurance. It delivers the soundless pressure of a stylus into earth, the steady insistence that something was seen, believed, feared, negotiated, obeyed, resisted, remembered. And when the last light in the room falls away, the wedges remain in their own small darkness, holding their shapes as they have held them for thousands of years, like a candle that does not flare again, but does not entirely vanish either.